My name is Lily, and I turned 18 earlier this year. As I reflect on my life while writing this, I can't help but notice how much everything has transformed. The life I once knew has been completely upended. I live in California with my parents in a spacious house that we've had for years. Our family has been fortunate in many ways, never facing financial struggles, and we've always enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle. My father, a real estate agent, worked tirelessly to build his career. He's a man of great strength and perseverance, with a rugged appearance that mirrors his personality. He has always been my role model, and I've admired his confidence and determination. My mother, on the other hand, is the heart of our family. A gentle and compassionate teacher, she has always put our needs before hers. She is patient, caring, and ever present when we need her. For years, everything felt perfect. Our family was well off, and we lived in a cozy home surrounded by the things we loved. However, that peace and security were shattered one fateful afternoon, and in the blink of an eye, everything changed. It was a dreary afternoon, with the sky overcast and heavy with dark clouds that seemed to loom over our house like an ill omen. My mother and I were in the kitchen, preparing dinner, just as we had many times before. We had grown accustomed to the comforting routine of our lives. My father would come home from work, and we'd sit down together to share a meal. The kitchen was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of my mother's soup simmering on the stove. Outside, the wind was cold, but inside, it felt like home. Then the phone rang, shattering the peaceful atmosphere. My mother answered, and I could hear my father's voice on the other end. His tone immediately alerted me that something was wrong. It wasn't his usual steady and confident voice. It trembled, almost unrecognizable. He told my mother that his company had gone bankrupt, that the money was gone, and there was no way to pay off the debts. Everything had been lost. He said we would have to sell our home, the house where I had spent most of my life. I stood frozen, watching my mother's face drain of color in disbelief. I could see the fear and confusion in her eyes as she tried to stay calm. She asked him what we should do now. "Tomorrow, you two must move back to the countryside," my father's voice said, sounding defeated. "Go live with your grandfather. At least there, we still have a roof over our heads." His words hit me like a slap. I couldn't understand how everything had changed so suddenly. My father had always been strong, always known how to fix things. But now, he was asking us to leave everything behind and start over. The thought of moving to my grandfather's house was terrifying. His home was in the countryside, a place I hadn't visited in years. My grandmother had passed away long ago, and since then, my grandfather had lived alone in a decaying house that had only gotten worse with time. My memories of him were filled with love. He had always treated me like I was his greatest treasure, but it had been so long since I had seen him, and the thought of living with him again was unsettling. I could barely remember his face. The next morning, my mother and I packed our things in silence. It was a strange, heavy process. My father had disappeared after giving us the news, and I was left to come to terms with the reality of what was happening. It was just the two of us in the car as we left the city. The landscape around us shifted from towering buildings and busy streets to open fields and dirt roads. The air became quieter, emptier, and I was overwhelmed with a deep sadness. It felt as though I was leaving behind everything that had defined my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that our past was slipping away, and all that lay ahead was uncertainty. When we finally arrived at my grandfather's house, it felt like stepping into a different world. The house looked just as I remembered, old and worn down by the years. The roof had faded and the paint on the walls had peeled away, exposing the crumbling bricks beneath. The house was surrounded by a large garden with fruit trees, but even the trees seemed neglected, their branches tangled and heavy. Hesitant, I stepped out of the car, unsure of what awaited me. It wasn't the warm, inviting home I once knew. The house stood there like a relic from the past, a reminder of everything we had lost. But then the door creaked open, and there he was, my grandfather. He looked thinner than I remembered, his back hunched with age. His deep eyes seemed wiser, yet distant. When he saw us, he smiled, and for a moment it felt like everything might be okay. He still had that warmth in his smile, but as he looked at me, I noticed something different in his gaze. It wasn't the loving, playful look I had remembered from my childhood. Instead, it was deeper, more intense. He smiled at me warmly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I attempted to dismiss the unsettling feeling, telling myself it was just his age and the passage of time that had changed him. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. We greeted my grandfather, and he invited us inside the house. The furniture was modest and old, but it was evident that he had tried to make the space as comfortable as possible. The house wasn't as luxurious as our previous one, but it had its own charm. He had cleaned everything and even prepared a bed for my mother and me. The first few days weren't ideal, but they were warm, and for the first time since the news of our downfall, I felt a slight sense of relief. The initial days were peaceful. My grandfather would share stories of his youth, and my mother began to adjust to the new life. However, as time went on, I started to notice something strange in my grandfather's gaze. Every time I stood in front of the mirror, combing my hair or brushing my clothes, I felt as though someone was watching me. Whenever I turned around, I would catch him staring. It wasn't the affectionate gaze of a loving grandfather anymore. It was something different. His stare was deep, almost too intense, and it made me uncomfortable. He was no longer the man I remembered. He had become someone else, someone who looked at me differently. I tried to rationalize it, attributing it to the changes in my life, yet thinking it was just because I had gotten older. But his eyes seemed to follow me everywhere. Every time I caught him staring, a chill ran down my spine, but I didn't speak to my mother about it. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, yet whenever my grandfather was near, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that washed over me. One afternoon, when my mother had gone into town, it was just my grandfather and me at the house. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. The sunlight streamed in through the window, casting a soft glow across the floor. It felt peaceful, or so I thought. My grandfather entered, holding a plate of fruit, neatly peeled apples, pears, and oranges, arranged with care. He placed the plate in front of me with a smile. "You should eat," he said gently. "It's good for your health." I smiled and thanked him, picking up an apple and taking a bite, but as I ate, I couldn't ignore the way he was looking at me. He had sat down in the chair across from me, his eyes never leaving me. At first, I thought he was just sitting there to rest, but the silence grew longer, and I began to feel uneasy. His gaze was unwavering, almost fixed, and the longer he stayed there, the more uncomfortable I became. I tried to focus on my book, but his eyes felt like a weight pressing down on me. After what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "You've really grown up. Just the other day, I was carrying you around in my arms, and now look at you. You've become such a beautiful young woman." His words sent a shock through me. I forced a smile, feeling my cheeks flush. "Yes, time flies," I replied softly, trying to avoid his gaze, but his eyes didn't leave me. They seemed to burn into me, and I felt an unease I couldn't explain. "The older you get," he continued, his voice soft but steady, "the more beautiful you become. You look just like your mother did when she was young, so beautiful, but you also have your own unique beauty. No one else can compare." I didn't know how to respond. The compliments made me feel uncomfortable, and I could feel my heart racing. "You flatter me, Grandpa," I said, trying to sound calm, but inside I was becoming more unsettled. I didn't know how to respond to his words, and they left me feeling confused. He went on, his voice low, filled with something else now. "I used to carry you around the garden when you were little. You were always so chatty, but now look at you. You've become such a graceful young woman with such a charming figure." I smiled lightly, trying to hide the discomfort I was feeling. "Yes, I remember those days. They were fun," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But his words didn't stop. "You're not just beautiful, Lily," he said, his eyes dark with emotion. "You're also charming. I'm sure the boys would be falling all over themselves for you. I just hope there's someone good enough to take care of you." My heart sank, and I felt my hands shaking as I turned the pages of my book. His words seemed to linger in the air, and I didn't know how to react. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. All I wanted to do was escape. "You're still young," I finally said, my voice trembling. "It's too early to think about that." Grandpa smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, you're right," he said, "but one day someone will come along. You're so beautiful." With that, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me there, shaken and confused. I sat there for a long time, unable to move or think. His words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled in my chest. From that moment on, I could no longer look at my grandfather the same way. I could no longer view my grandfather the way I once did. His eyes, once warm and filled with love, had changed. They had become filled with something else, something darker. Every time he gazed at me, it felt as though I was being analyzed, as if he no longer saw me as his granddaughter, but as something entirely different. The tension between us grew, and I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me. I tried to avoid him as much as possible, but there was no escape. Each time our eyes met, I felt suffocated. Finally, one morning, my mother left again, and it was just my grandfather and me in the house. The silence was deafening. He entered the room and stood in front of me, his eyes filled with a darkness I had never seen before. "Lily," he said, his voice low and full of longing, "I want you." My body froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "Grandpa?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "You can't say that. You're my grandfather." He stepped closer, his voice growing more urgent. "I've thought about this for so long. You're so beautiful, Lily. You've grown into such a perfect woman, and I can't help myself. I want you to be mine." My heart raced as I stepped back, panic flooding my mind. "Grandpa, no, we can't. We can't be like this. Please, stop." His face twisted in confusion, then in something else, something darker. "Why not?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. "I've never loved anyone like this before. You're perfect." "Please," I begged, my voice trembling with fear. "We can't. We're family." He stopped, and for a moment his face softened, as if realizing what he had said. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I shouldn't have said that. I don't know what happened to me." I turned away, my heart pounding. Slowly, he stepped back, his eyes filled with guilt. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, trembling. Finally, he walked away, leaving me alone in the room. That was the last time I ever spoke to him in the same way. Our relationship had changed forever. There was an unspoken distance between us now, one that neither of us could bridge. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't stay there any longer. Eventually, my parents managed to stabilize our lives, and we left my grandfather's house behind. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I no longer had to endure the growing tension, but sadness because the bond with my grandfather could never be the same again. As we drove away from the house, I caught one last glimpse of my grandfather standing in the garden. His face was filled with regret and sorrow, and I could feel the weight of everything that had transpired. But it no longer mattered. I had learned a difficult lesson. The most important lesson I took from this experience is the necessity of respecting boundaries, especially in family relationships. It's crucial to trust your feelings and speak up when something feels wrong. Silence can worsen situations and lead to long-term emotional damage. If something makes you uncomfortable, it's important to voice your concerns and seek help from trusted individuals. Always protect yourself and ensure relationships are based on mutual respect and understanding.